Listen carefully to what I am about to tell you. Some stories begin with a scream, a gunshot, a missing face on a poster. This one starts with a storage unit auction on a cold Tuesday afternoon, rain drumming on corrugated metal roofs, and a box that nobody should have found. My name does not matter. What matters is that I follow trails most people would rather ignore. I work cases that have gone cold, not because they were solved, but because someone decided they should stop being asked about. This case found me through a phone call from a man named Dennis Howell, an estate sale buyer who specialized in abandoned storage units. He had a voice like gravel, and he was scared. He told me he had won an auction 3 weeks earlier. Unit 217 at Secure Storage, a facility on the industrial edge of a town I will call Millridge. The unit had been abandoned for 7 years. No payments, no contact, no forwarding address. Standard procedure. After a certain period, the contents go to auction. Dennis bought it for $300. He expected furniture, old electronics, maybe some tools. What he found instead was a cardboard box sealed with duct tape, sitting alone in the center of an otherwise empty 10 by 10 space. Inside the box were photographs, dozens of them, Polaroids and printed images, some creased, some water damaged. They showed the same woman in different locations: a diner booth, a parking lot at night, walking out of a grocery store, standing by a payphone. In every photograph, she was unaware. The angles were wrong, taken from across streets, through windows, from behind cars. Surveillance shots. Beneath the photographs was a spiral notebook, pages of handwritten notes, dates, times, locations, routes she took to work, the grocery store she preferred, the name of her dog, details that should not exist unless someone had been watching her for months. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, was a single item: a woman's driver's license. The photo matched the surveillance images. Her name was Laura Voss. The license had expired 9 years ago. Dennis did what most people would do. He called the police. They took the box, thanked him, and told him they would look into it. That was 3 weeks ago. He heard nothing. No follow-up. No questions. When he called the department twice, he was told the case was being handled and that he did not need to worry. But Dennis was worried. He could not shake the feeling that the box had been buried on purpose and that someone was relieved it had stayed buried. That is when he called me. I drove to Millridge on a Wednesday morning. The sky was low and grey, threatening rain that would not stop for days. Millridge is one of those towns that used to build things, back when factories ran at capacity and shifts changed 3 times a day. Now the factories are gutted shells, and the population has bled out to bigger cities. The people who remain are the ones who cannot afford to leave, or who have reasons to stay that they do not talk about. Secure Storage sits on the eastern edge of town, tucked between a shuttered lumber yard and a stretch of chain-link fence that runs along the train tracks. The facility is 2 rows of units, maybe 60 total, most of them locked and silent. The office is a prefab trailer with a fading sign and bars on the windows. I met the manager there, a woman in her 50s named Carol Brink. She had the tired, wary look of someone who has learned not to ask too many questions. I told her I was researching a story about abandoned storage units and cold cases. I did not mention Laura Voss by name. I asked about Unit 217. Carol pulled up the records without hesitation. The unit had been rented in cash, month to month, starting in May of that year. The renter's name was listed as Michael Stern. No forwarding address. No phone number on file. Payments stopped after 11 months. The unit sat untouched for 7 years before it went to auction. I asked if she remembered Michael Stern. She shook her head. Cash transactions did not require ID back then, and she had been working there less than 4 years. I asked if I could see the unit. She hesitated, then nodded. She led me across the lot, keys jangling on a lanyard, rain starting to speckle the asphalt. Unit 217 was in the back row. The door had been rolled down and locked again after the auction. Carol opened it and stepped aside. The space was empty now. Concrete floor, metal walls, a single fluorescent fixture that flickered when she hit the switch. But the emptiness felt wrong, like something had been removed in a hurry. I asked Carol if the police had come back after they picked up the box. She frowned. She said no. They took the evidence and left. No one had returned. I stood in the doorway and looked at the floor. There were faint scuff marks where the box had been, and something else, a small dark stain near the back corner, no bigger than a dinner plate. It could have been oil. It could have been rust from a leaking container. Or it could have been something else entirely. I took photographs. I measured the space. I asked Carol for a copy of the rental agreement. She printed it for me without argument, and I got the sense that she wanted someone to care about this more than the police seemed to. Back in my car, I ran Laura Voss through every database I had access to. Social media, public records, court filings, obituaries. The results were thin. Laura had lived in Millridge until she was 26. She worked at a medical supply company on the north side of town. No criminal record. No marriage license. No property ownership. And then, 9 years ago, she vanished from the public record entirely. No death certificate. No forwarding address. No social media updates. She simply stopped existing in any official capacity. I found one reference in a local newspaper archive, a brief notice in the community section from 9 years ago. It mentioned that Laura Voss had relocated out of state for personal reasons and would be missed by her co-workers. The notice felt sterile, pre-written, like someone had called it in. I tried the medical supply company next. It had closed 6 years ago, but I tracked down the former office manager through LinkedIn. Her name was Diane Rucker, and she agreed to meet me at a diner on the south end of town. Diane was cautious. She ordered coffee and kept her hands wrapped around the cup like she was cold. I told her I was looking into Laura Voss. Her expression tightened immediately. She said Laura had been a good employee, quiet, reliable, kept to herself. But in the months before she left, something changed. Laura started coming in late. She looked tired, distracted. She asked Diane once if the company kept logs of who entered the building after hours. Diane said yes. They had a sign-in sheet at the front desk. Laura nodded and did not bring it up again. 2 weeks later, Laura stopped showing up. No call, no explanation. Diane tried her home number and got no answer. She drove to Laura's apartment and found it empty. The landlord said Laura had paid through the end of the month, and left no forwarding information. Diane filed a missing person report, but the police told her that Laura was an adult and had likely chosen to leave. They closed the case within a week. I asked Diane if Laura had mentioned anyone bothering her. Diane hesitated. She said Lara never used those words, but she had the feeling something was wrong. Lara started locking her desk. She stopped eating lunch in the break room. And once, Diane saw her looking out the window at the parking lot for a long time, like she was watching for someone. I asked if Diane remembered anyone unusual coming to the office around that time. She thought for a moment, then nodded. There was a man who came in a few times, claiming to be a vendor. He never had an appointment. He would ask for Laura specifically, but Laura always refused to see him. Diane described him as average height, clean-cut, polite. He drove a dark sedan. She could not remember the make. I asked if the police had ever followed up on that detail. Diane shook her head. She told them about the man during her missing person report, but no one seemed interested. We sat in silence for a moment. Rain streaked the diner windows. Diane looked at me and said something I have heard before in cases like this. She said she always felt like Lara did not leave on her own. She felt like someone made her disappear. I paid for the coffee and thanked her. Outside, the rain was heavier now. I sat in my car and reviewed my notes. Laura Voss had been watched, stalked, documented. Someone had collected evidence of her movements, her habits, her routines. That evidence had been sealed in a box and hidden in a storage unit under a fake name. And 9 years ago, Laura had vanished without a trace. The police had taken the box and done nothing. I needed to know why. I spent the next 2 days trying to get someone at the Millridge Police Department to talk to me. I called the main line. I left messages. I sent emails. No one responded. Finally, I drove to the station in person, a low brick building on the west side of town, with a parking lot full of patrol cars that looked like they had not moved in days. The front desk officer was a man in his early 30s with a name tag that read Corporal Hayes. I told him I was following up on evidence submitted 3 weeks ago, a box of photographs and personal effects related to Laura Voss. I said I wanted to know the status of the investigation. Hayes looked at me for a long moment. Then he said he would check. He disappeared into a back hallway. I waited. 15 minutes passed. When he came back, he was accompanied by a detective, a man in his 50s with graying hair and a face that gave nothing away. His name was Detective Paul Grimmer. Grimmer told me that the evidence had been logged and reviewed. He said there was no active investigation because there was no evidence of a crime. The photographs were unusual, he admitted, but they did not prove anything illegal had occurred. Laura Voss had left town of her own accord. The case was closed. I asked why no one had tried to locate Laura to confirm she was safe. Grimmer said they had run her name through state databases and found no red flags. She was not listed as endangered. She had not been reported missing recently. As far as the department was concerned, she was an adult who chose to move on. I asked about the notebook, the detailed surveillance logs, the driver's license. Grimmer's expression did not change. He said those items were being held as evidence in case new information came to light. but there was no basis for an investigation at this time. I pushed. I asked if they had identified Michael Stern, the man who rented the unit. Grimmer said they were looking into it, but the name was likely an alias and they had no leads. I asked why they had not followed up with Dennis Howell, the man who found the evidence. Grimmer said there was no need. Dennis had reported what he found. The police had taken possession. That was the end of his involvement. The conversation felt like a wall. Every question I asked hit the same answer. No crime, no investigation, no further action. I thanked Grimmer and left. But as I walked back to my car, I felt the weight of something wrong. This was not incompetence. This was deliberate. Someone in that building did not want Laura Voss's case reopened. I sat in the parking lot and made a list. I needed to find Laura. I needed to identify Michael Stern. And I needed to understand why the police were so determined to bury this. The rain hammered the windshield. I turned the wipers on and pulled out onto the street. Somewhere in Millridge, there were answers. I just had to find someone willing to give them to me. And that was going to be the hard part. I started with the assumption that if Laura Voss had disappeared 9 years ago, someone in Millridge still remembered her. Small towns have long memories, especially when it comes to people who vanish without explanation. I needed to find someone who knew her well enough to fill in the gaps the police had left empty. I went back to the medical supply company records. Diane Rucker had given me the names of 2 other employees who had worked with Laura, a warehouse supervisor named Greg Talbot, and a sales associate named Jennifer Marsh. Greg had moved to another state years ago, but Jennifer was still in Millridge. I found her through a business registry. She was working as a receptionist at a dental office on the north side of town. I called ahead and asked if I could speak with her during her lunch break. She was hesitant at first, but when I mentioned Laura's name, she agreed. We met at a small sandwich shop 2 blocks from her office. Jennifer was in her early 40s, with tired eyes and the kind of careful politeness that comes from years of customer service work. She ordered a salad and did not touch it. I told her I was investigating Laura's disappearance and that new evidence had surfaced. I did not go into detail about the storage unit. I wanted to see what she remembered first. Jennifer said she and Laura had been friendly at work, but not close. They had lunch together sometimes, talked about movies and weekend plans. Laura was quiet, Jennifer said, but not unfriendly. She had a dog, a black lab mix named Boone. She liked hiking. She read a lot. She did not talk much about her personal life. I asked if Laura had dated anyone. Jennifer shook her head. She said Laura mentioned once that she had been in a relationship a few years earlier, but it had ended badly, and she was not interested in dating again. Jennifer got the sense that it had been more than just a breakup. There was something about the way Laura said it that made Jennifer think the guy had been controlling. Maybe worse. I asked if Laura ever mentioned his name. Jennifer thought hard, then said she could not remember. She said Laura never brought him up again after that conversation. I asked about the man who used to come to the office asking for Laura. Jennifer remembered him. She said he came in maybe 4 or 5 times over the course of a month. He always said he was there to discuss a business matter, but he never had an appointment, and Laura always refused to see him. Jennifer said the man was polite, but there was something off about him. He smiled too much. he lingered too long in the lobby, and every time Lara turned him away, he would nod and leave without argument, like he was not bothered at all. I asked if Jennifer ever saw him outside the office. She hesitated, then nodded. She said she saw him once in the parking lot after her shift ended. He was sitting in a dark blue sedan, just sitting there with the engine off. Jennifer got in her car and left, but she noticed that Laura's car was still in the lot. She did not think much of it at the time, but later, when Laura disappeared, she remembered it. I asked if she told the police. Jennifer said yes. She told them about the man, about the car, about how Laura seemed scared of him. The officer who took her statement wrote it all down, but Jennifer never heard anything back. The case was closed within days. I asked if she remembered the officer's name. She did not. Jennifer looked at me across the table and said something that stuck with me. She said she always wondered if Laura left because she had to, or if someone made sure she could not stay. She said the whole thing felt wrong from the beginning, and the fact that no one seemed to care made it worse. I thanked her and gave her my contact information in case she remembered anything else. As I walked back to my car, I felt the pieces starting to align. Laura had been stalked. She had been afraid. And the man who came to her office was the most likely suspect. But without a name, without a license plate, without any official follow-up, I had nothing solid. I needed to find that car. I spent the next day combing through old traffic camera footage requests and parking lot surveillance from businesses near the medical supply company. Most of the footage had been deleted or overwritten years ago, but I found one lead. A small auto repair shop across the street had kept its security tapes longer than most. The owner, a man named Ray Childress, was reluctant to let me look through 9-year-old footage, but when I explained what I was investigating, he softened. It took hours. The tapes were stored on old VHS cassettes, poorly labeled, and the playback quality was terrible. But finally, I found it. A clip from late afternoon, 9 years ago, 2 weeks before Laura disappeared. A dark blue sedan parked across the street from the medical supply company. The angle was bad, but I could make out part of the license plate. I wrote it down. Ray let me take a photo of the screen. I thanked him and left. Back in my car, I ran the partial plate through a contact I have in the DMV. It took 2 days, but she came back with a match. The car was registered to a man named Evan Collier. At the time, he lived in Millridge. I cross-referenced the name with property records, employment databases, and court filings. Evan Collier was 34 years old when Laura disappeared. He worked as an independent IT consultant, servicing small businesses in the area. He had no criminal record. He had owned a home on the south side of town, but he sold it 8 years ago and moved. I traced his current address to a town 2 hours north of Millridge. I also found something else. 3 years before Laura disappeared, Evan Collier had filed a restraining order against a woman named Michelle Draper. The order was temporary and had expired, but the filing mentioned harassment, unwanted contact, and threatening behavior. I could not access the full case details, but it was enough to establish a pattern. Evan Collier had been involved in a relationship that ended badly, and he had legal documentation of the fallout. I wondered if Laura had been the next target. I decided to drive to Evan's current address. I did not call ahead. I wanted to see his reaction in person. The town where Evan lived now was smaller than Millridge, quieter, surrounded by farmland and state forest. His house was a single-story ranch at the end of a gravel road, set back from the main route. The property was neat, but isolated. No neighbors within sight. A silver SUV was parked in the driveway. I knocked on the door. A man answered. He was in his mid-40s now, thinning hair, glasses, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. He looked at me with the polite confusion of someone who does not get many visitors. I introduced myself as a journalist, working on a story about unsolved disappearances in the area. I asked if he had a few minutes to talk. He hesitated, then nodded and stepped out onto the porch. He did not invite me inside. I asked if he remembered living in Millridge. He said yes. I asked if he remembered a woman named Laura Voss. His expression did not change, but his body language shifted. He crossed his arms. He said he remembered the name. He said they had worked together briefly. I asked where. He said he had done some IT work for the medical supply company where she was employed. I asked if they had been friends. He said no, just professional acquaintances. I asked if he had ever visited her at the office, outside of scheduled work. He paused. Then he said he might have stopped by once or twice to follow up on a project. I asked why Laura had refused to see him. He frowned and said he did not know what I was talking about. I pressed. I told him that multiple witnesses remembered him coming to the office repeatedly, asking for Laura and being turned away. I said Laura had appeared frightened of him. Evan's face hardened. He said that was not true. He said if Laura had a problem with him, she never said so. He said he had no idea why anyone would think he was bothering her. I asked where he was when Laura disappeared. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he said he did not have to answer that. He said I was making accusations without evidence. He said if I continued, he would contact a lawyer. I thanked him for his time and left. As I drove away, I watched him in the rearview mirror. He stood on the porch, watching my car until I turned onto the main road. Evan Collier was lying. I could feel it. But lying is not a crime, and I had no proof that he had done anything illegal. I needed more. I called Dennis Howell, the man who had bought the storage unit. I asked if he still had any documentation from the auction, anything that might give me more information about how the unit had been rented or who had access to it. Dennis said he had kept the auction receipt and a copy of the unit manifest. He offered to scan and email them to me. When the files came through, I studied them carefully. The unit manifest listed the original rental date, the renter's name, and the payment history. Michael Stern had paid in cash every month for 11 months. The payments stopped abruptly in April, 9 years ago. That was 1 month before Laura disappeared. I wondered if Michael Stern and Evan Collier were the same person. I had no way to prove it yet, but the timeline fit. If Evan had rented the unit to store evidence of his surveillance, and if something happened to Laura shortly after he stopped paying, then the storage unit was not just a hiding place. It was a trophy case. I needed to confirm Evan's movements 9 years ago. I started with his work history. I contacted the businesses he had serviced as an IT consultant. Most of them were gone now, but I found one small accounting firm that still had records. The office manager, an older woman named Patty Lenz, was willing to talk. She remembered Evan. She said he had done work for them on and off for a few years. She described him as professional, but odd. He asked a lot of personal questions, she said. He wanted to know who worked late, who had access to the server room, who lived alone. Patty thought it was strange, but she chalked it up to him being socially awkward. I asked if Evan had worked for them around the time Laura disappeared. Patty checked her records and confirmed that he had been scheduled for a server upgrade in early May of that year, but he had cancelled at the last minute. He said he had a family emergency and would reschedule. He never did. I asked if she remembered anything else unusual about that time. She thought for a moment, then said that Evan had seemed distracted during his last visit. He kept checking his phone. He left earlier than planned. Patty had not thought much of it then, but looking back, she said it felt off. I thanked her and ended the call. The pieces were coming together, but I still did not have enough to take to the police. I needed something concrete. I needed to find Laura. I decided to search for Laura Voss more aggressively. I ran her name through every database I could access, including social security records, utility bills, vehicle registrations, and employment filings. I checked obituaries in surrounding states. I checked hospital admission records. I checked prison databases. Nothing. It was like Laura had been erased. Then I tried something different. I searched for her dog, Boone, the black lab mix. I ran searches for dog licensing records, veterinary clinic databases, and animal shelter intakes. It was a long shot, but sometimes the smallest details leave the longest trails. I found a hit. 7 years ago, a black lab mix named Boone had been surrendered to an animal shelter 3 hours west of Millridge. The surrender form listed the owner as anonymous. The dog had been adopted 2 weeks later by a family in the area. I called the shelter and spoke to the director. She remembered Boone. She said the dog had been brought in by a man who said he had found it wandering near a highway rest stop. The man did not leave contact information. The dog had no microchip. The shelter staff had noted that the dog seemed well cared for, not like a stray. I asked if the shelter had any security footage from that time. The director said no. The system had been upgraded years ago, and the old footage was gone. I asked if she remembered anything about the man who brought Boone in. She thought hard. Then she said he had been polite, middle-aged, driving a blue car. She could not remember anything else. A blue car. I felt my pulse quicken. It was circumstantial, but it was another thread connecting Evan Collier to Laura's disappearance. If Evan had taken Laura's dog and dumped it at a shelter hours away, it meant he had been trying to erase traces of her. And if he was willing to do that, what else had he done? I needed to go back to Millridge. I needed to talk to the police again. And this time, I needed them to take me seriously. But when I called the Millridge Police Department and asked for Detective Grimmer, I was told he was unavailable. I left a message. He did not call back. I tried again the next day. Same result. I decided to go to the station in person. When I arrived, Corporal Hayes was not at the front desk. A different officer, younger, with a name tag reading Officer Navarro, greeted me. I asked to speak with Detective Grimmer. Navarro said Grimmer was out on a call. I said, I would wait. I sat in the lobby for 2 hours. Grimmer never appeared. Finally, Navarro came back and said Grimmer had been called to another location and would not be available today. He suggested I leave a detailed message and someone would follow up. I knew I was being stonewalled. I left the station and sat in my car, trying to figure out my next move. That is when my phone rang. The number was blocked. I answered. A woman's voice, quiet and shaking, said my name. Then she said she had information about Laura Voss. She said she could not talk long. She said if I wanted to know what really happened, I needed to meet her. She gave me an address, a diner on the edge of town, tomorrow night at 8. I asked who she was. She hung up. I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone. I did not know if this was a lead or a trap, but I knew I had to go. The next night, I drove to the diner. It was one of those places that stays open late for truckers and third shift workers, all fluorescent lights and cracked vinyl booths. The parking lot was nearly empty. I went inside and took a booth near the back where I could see the door. At 8:15, a woman walked in. She was in her late 30s, wearing a jacket with the hood pulled up. She looked around nervously, then spotted me and walked over. She slid into the booth across from me without saying a word. I waited. She kept her hands folded on the table, her eyes darting toward the door every few seconds. Finally, she spoke. She said her name was Angela. She said she used to work dispatch at the Millridge Police Department. She had left the job 5 years ago, but she still remembered the night Laura Voss's case came in. She said Dennis Howell had called to report the storage unit evidence, and the call had been logged. A patrol officer was sent to collect the box. But the next morning, when Angela came in for her shift, the case file was gone. Not archived, not transferred. Gone. She said she asked her supervisor about it. He told her the case had been reassigned to Detective Grimmer and that she did not need to worry about it. But Angela knew something was wrong. Case files did not just disappear. And when she checked the evidence log later, the box from the storage unit was listed, but there was no investigation number attached. It was filed as miscellaneous recovered property. Angela said she kept quiet. She needed the job, but it bothered her. A few weeks later, she overheard Grimmer talking to another officer in the break room. Grimmer said the Voss case was a dead end, and that it was better to let it stay buried. The other officer had laughed and agreed. Angela said she quit not long after that. She could not work somewhere that buried cases on purpose. I asked why she was telling me this now. She said she had seen my name in a community forum online, asking questions about Laura Voss. She said she felt guilty for staying silent. She said if I was going to dig into this, I needed to know that the police were not going to help. In fact, they were going to do everything they could to stop me. I asked if she knew why Grimmer wanted the case buried. She shook her head. She said she did not know, but she had a theory. She said Grimmer had connections all over Millridge. He had been on the force for over 20 years. He knew everyone. And if someone with influence wanted a case to go away, Grimmer was the man who made it happen. I asked if she thought Grimmer was protecting Evan Collier. Angela looked at me sharply. She said she did not know that name. I told her about Evan, about the surveillance. about the car. Angela's face went pale. She said there was one more thing. She said a few months before Laura disappeared, there had been another case. A woman named Sarah Linden had filed a harassment complaint. She said a man had been following her, taking pictures, showing up at her work. The complaint was filed, but it was dismissed a week later. Sarah withdrew it and left town. Angela said she remembered the case because Sarah had seemed terrified when she came in to file the report. I asked if Angela remembered who had handled the case. She nodded. Detective Grimmer. I felt the ground shift under me. This was not just about Laura. This was a pattern, and Grimmer had been involved in burying it from the beginning. Angela stood up. She said she had to go. She said she had already said too much. She told me to be careful. She said people in Millridge did not like outsiders asking questions, and if I pushed too hard, I would find out why. She left before I could ask anything else. I sat in the booth for a long time, trying to process what I had just learned. Grimmer was not just indifferent. He was actively protecting someone. And if Sarah Linden had been another victim, then Laura was not the first, and she might not have been the last. I needed to find Sarah Linden. I needed to know what happened to her and why she left. If I could connect her case to Evan Collier, I would have enough to force someone to listen. But first, I needed to be very, very careful. Because now I knew I was not just investigating a cold case. I was investigating a cover-up. And someone in Millridge was willing to go to great lengths to keep it hidden. I spent the next morning searching for Sarah Linden. The name was common enough that it took time to narrow down the right person. I started with the harassment complaint Angela had mentioned. If it had been filed with the Millridge Police Department, there should have been a record, even if the case was closed. I submitted a public records request. The response came back 2 days later. No records found matching that name and time frame. Either the complaint had been purged from the system, or it had never been officially logged in the first place. I tried a different approach. I searched for Sarah Linden in property records, vehicle registrations, and employment databases in Millridge from 9 to 12 years ago. I found a hit. A Sarah M. Linden had rented an apartment on the east side of town 11 years ago. The lease had lasted 6 months. Then she moved out. No forwarding address. I contacted the property management company. They still had records from that period, but they were stored off-site in a warehouse. The woman on the phone said it would take a few days to pull the file. I told her it was urgent. She said she would do what she could. While I waited, I went back to Evan Collier's background. I wanted to know more about his life in Millridge, his work history, his social connections. I pulled his business registration records. He had operated as a sole proprietor under the name Collier Tech Solutions. His client list was not public, but I found invoices and work orders in a few small business archives. One name caught my attention: Millridge Medical Supply, the company where Laura Voss had worked. Evan had been contracted to upgrade their network security 2 months before Laura disappeared. That meant he had access to the building, to the employee schedules, to the office layout. He would have known when Laura was there, when she was alone, and how to avoid being seen. I also found something else. Evan had done work for the Millridge Police Department. 3 years before Lara disappeared, he had been hired to service their dispatch computers. It was a small contract, only a few weeks of work, but it meant Evan had been inside the police station. He would have known how their systems worked. He would have known who to talk to, how cases were logged, maybe even how evidence was stored. And if Evan had built a relationship with someone in that department, someone like Detective Grimmer, then it was possible Grimmer owed him a favor. Or worse, Grimmer had his own reasons to protect Evan. I needed to know more about Grimmer. I started digging into his career history. Paul Grimmer had been with the Millridge Police Department for 23 years. He had started as a patrol officer, moved up to detective, and had been handling major cases for over a decade. His record looked clean on paper. No disciplinary actions, no complaints, no red flags. But clean records can be deceiving. I reached out to a few retired officers from the department, people who had worked with Grimmer over the years. Most of them did not want to talk. One finally agreed to meet me, off the record, at a bar 2 towns over. His name was Roy Pittman. He had been a sergeant before he retired 6 years ago. He ordered a beer and told me he would give me 10 minutes, no more. I asked what kind of detective Grimmer was. Roy took a long drink and said Grimmer was good at closing cases. Too good. Sometimes. Roy said Grimmer had a way of making problems disappear. If a case was messy, if it involved someone with connections, Grimmer knew how to handle it quietly. Roy said he had always assumed Grimmer was just efficient. But looking back, he wondered if efficient was the right word. I asked if Roy remembered the Laura Voss case. He shook his head. He said he had retired before that case came in. But he remembered another case, years earlier. A woman had reported being stalked. She said someone had broken into her apartment, moved things around, taken photos of her while she slept. Grimmer had handled it. The case was closed within a week. Grimmer said the woman was unstable, that there was no evidence of a break-in, and that she had likely imagined the whole thing. Roy said he had reviewed the file later, out of curiosity. The woman's story had been detailed, specific, and consistent, but Grimmer had dismissed it without investigating. Roy said it bothered him, but he never pushed it. Grimmer had seniority, and Roy did not want to make waves. I asked if Roy remembered the woman's name. He said he did not. The case was too old, and he had not thought about it in years. I asked if he thought Grimmer was corrupt. Roy stared into his beer for a long time. Then he said he did not know. He said Grimmer was smart, careful, and well-connected. If Grimmer was doing something wrong, he was good at hiding it. And in a small department like Millridge, where everyone knew everyone, it was easy to make things disappear if you knew the right people. Roy finished his beer and left. I sat there alone, turning over what he had told me. Grimmer was not just covering up one case. He had a history of dismissing complaints, closing cases without investigation, and protecting certain people from scrutiny. And if Evan Collier was one of those people, then Laura's disappearance was not an isolated incident. It was part of something bigger. I needed proof, and I needed to find Sarah Linden. 3 days later, the property management company called. They had found Sarah's rental file. I drove to their office and reviewed the paperwork. The file included a copy of her lease, her rental application, and her move-out notice. On the application, she had listed an emergency contact, a woman named Patricia Linden, with a phone number and an address in a town about 90 miles south of Millridge. I called the number. A woman answered I introduced myself and asked if she was related to Sarah Linden. There was a long pause. Then she said yes, Sarah was her daughter. I asked if I could speak with Sarah. Patricia said that was not possible. I asked why. Patricia's voice tightened. She said Sarah did not talk about Millridge anymore. She said Sarah had been through enough, and she did not need someone dragging it all back up. I told Patricia I was investigating a case that might be connected to what happened to Sarah. I said I believed Sarah had been targeted by the same person who hurt someone else. Patricia was silent for a long time. Then she said she would talk to Sarah, but she could not promise anything. 2 days later, Patricia called me back. She said Sarah had agreed to meet me, but only if I came to her. She gave me an address in the town where Patricia lived. I drove down the next morning. Sarah lived in a small house on a quiet street. She answered the door herself. She was in her late 30s, thin, with dark circles under her eyes. She looked like someone who had not slept well in years. We sat in her living room. Patricia stayed in the kitchen, within earshot, like she was standing guard. Sarah did not look at me when she spoke. She said she had moved to Millridge 11 years ago for a job. She worked as an administrative assistant at a law firm downtown. She lived alone. She kept to herself. For the first few months, everything was fine. Then she started noticing things, small things. Her apartment door would be unlocked when she was certain she had locked it. Items in her bedroom would be moved slightly, just enough to notice. She thought she was imagining it at first. Then she found a photograph tucked under her pillow. It was a picture of her, asleep in her bed, taken from the doorway of her bedroom. She called the police immediately. Detective Grimmer was assigned to her case. He came to her apartment, looked around, and asked her a lot of questions. He wanted to know if she had been drinking, if she had a history of mental illness, if she had any enemies. Sarah said no to all of it. She said someone had broken in and taken that photo, and she wanted them found. Grimmer told her there was no sign of forced entry. He said the photograph could have been taken by anyone at any time. He suggested she change her locks and be more careful about who she let into her home. Then he closed the case. Sarah said she did not feel safe after that. She started having panic attacks. She could not sleep. She felt like she was being watched all the time. A week later, she saw a man sitting in a car outside her apartment. She recognized the car. It was the same car she had seen in the parking lot at her work, at the grocery store, at the gym. A dark blue sedan. She called the police again. Grimmer came back. Sarah told him about the car, about the man, about how she had seen him multiple times in different places. Grimmer wrote it all down. He said he would look into it, but nothing happened. No follow-up, no investigation. 2 weeks later, Sarah came home from work and found her apartment door wide open. Nothing was stolen, but her bedroom had been torn apart. Clothes pulled from drawers, mattress flipped, closet emptied, and on her bathroom mirror, someone had written a message in lipstick. "I am always watching." Sarah packed a bag that night and left. She did not go back to work. She did not file another police report. She moved in with her mother and never returned to Millridge. I asked if she ever learned who was stalking her. She shook her head. She said she tried to move on, tried to forget, but she still had nightmares. She still checked her logs 3 times before bed. She still felt like someone was watching her, even though she knew it was not rational. I asked if she remembered what the man in the blue sedan looked like. Sarah closed her eyes. She said she only saw him from a distance. Average height, clean cut, glasses. She said he looked normal. That was what scared her the most. He looked like someone you would not notice. I showed her a photograph of Evan Collier. It was an old driver's license photo I had pulled from public records. Sarah stared at it for a long time. Then she nodded. She said, "That was him." I felt my chest tighten. Evan Collier had stalked Sarah Linden. He had broken into her home, terrorized her, driven her out of town, and Detective Grimmer had done nothing to stop him. I asked Sarah if she would be willing to make a formal statement. She shook her head immediately. She said she could not go through that again. She said she had tried to report it, and no one had helped her. She said if I wanted to use what she told me, I could, but she would not testify. She would not go back to Millridge. She would not put herself through that trauma again. I understood. I thanked her and left. On the drive back, I tried to piece together the timeline. Sarah had been stalked 11 years ago. Lara disappeared 9 years ago. That was a 2-year gap. I wondered if there had been others in between. Women who had been targeted but never reported it, or who had reported it and been dismissed like Sarah. I also wondered what had escalated. Sarah had been terrorized and driven away, but as far as I knew, she had not been physically harmed. Laura, on the other hand, had vanished completely. What had changed? Had Evan gotten bolder? Had something gone wrong? And where was Laura now? I needed to go back to the storage unit. The box Dennis Howell had found was evidence of surveillance, but it was also evidence of obsession. Evan had kept that box for months after Lara disappeared. He had paid rent on the unit to keep it hidden. Then he stopped paying, and the box sat there for 7 years, waiting to be found. Why stop paying? Had Evan moved on? Had he felt safe enough that he did not need to hide the evidence anymore? Or had something else happened? I called Carol Brink, the storage facility manager. I asked if I could come back and look at the unit again. She said sure, but she did not know what else I would find. The unit had been cleaned out after the auction. I went anyway. When I arrived, Carol let me into Unit 217. I stood in the doorway and looked at the empty space. The concrete floor, the metal walls, the faint stain in the back corner. I crouched down and examined the stain more closely. It was old, set deep into the concrete. I scraped at it with my fingernail and came away with a dark residue. I took a sample. I did not have access to a lab, but I knew someone who did. A forensic consultant I had worked with on another case. I sent her the sample and asked if she could tell me what it was. 2 days later, she called me back. She said the sample contained trace amounts of human blood. Not enough to run a DNA profile, but enough to confirm it was blood. She said based on the degradation and the way it had set into the concrete, it was at least several years old. I sat down hard in my car. Blood in the storage unit. Laura's surveillance photos in the storage unit. Evan Collier, connected to both Sarah and Laura. Grimmer covering up both cases. I had enough. I needed to take this to someone who could do something about it. But I knew the Millridge Police Department would not help. I needed to go higher. I contacted the state police. I spoke with a detective in the Major Crimes Unit and laid out everything I had found. The surveillance photos, the blood, Evan Collier's pattern of stalking, Grimmer's refusal to investigate. The detective listened carefully and said he would look into it. 3 days later, he called me back. He said he had contacted the Millridge Police Department to request the evidence from the storage unit. Detective Grimmer told him the evidence had been reviewed and found to be unrelated to any open investigation. Grimmer said the blood sample I had taken was not chain of custody compliant and could not be used as evidence. The state detective said there was nothing he could do without cooperation from the local department. I was being shut down at every level. I sat in my apartment and stared at my notes. I had proof. I had witnesses. I had a clear pattern of behavior. But none of it mattered if the people in power refused to act. That is when I realized I had been approaching this wrong. I had been trying to work within the system, but the system was protecting Evan Collier. If I wanted justice for Laura, for Sarah, for anyone else Evan had hurt, I needed to go around the system. I needed to make this public. I started writing. I compiled everything I had learned into a detailed investigative report. I included Sarah's testimony, the surveillance photos, the blood evidence, Evan's work history, Grimmer's pattern of dismissing cases. I named names. I laid out the timeline. I made it impossible to ignore. Then I published it online. I posted it to true crime forums, sent it to local journalists, shared it on social media. I made sure it could not be buried. The response was immediate. Within hours, the story was being shared across multiple platforms. People in Millridge started talking. Former employees of the medical supply company came forward with their own stories about Evan. A woman from a neighboring town said she had been harassed by a man matching Evan's description 5 years ago. Another woman said the same thing. The pressure mounted. Local news outlets picked up the story. A reporter from a regional newspaper called me for an interview. I told her everything. 2 days later, the state police announced they were opening an investigation into the Millridge Police Department's handling of harassment complaints. They also said they were looking into Evan Collier as a person of interest in multiple cases. Evan's house was searched. They found more photographs, more notebooks, names and addresses of women Evan had targeted over the years. They found hard drives full of surveillance footage. They found a burner phone with texts that had been sent to victims, threatening them, telling them he was watching. But they did not find Laura. Evan was arrested and charged with stalking, harassment, and unlawful surveillance. The charges were serious, but without a body, without proof of what had happened to Laura, they could not charge him with anything more. I attended his arraignment. He sat in the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, his expression blank. When the judge read the charges, he did not react. When his lawyer entered a not guilty plea, he nodded once, like he had expected it. I stared at him from the gallery. I wanted him to look at me. I wanted him to know that I was the one who had brought him down. But he never turned around. After the hearing, I stood outside the courthouse in the rain. A woman approached me. She was in her 50s, with graying hair and red-rimmed eyes. She said her name was Ellen Voss. She said Laura was her daughter. I had not known Laura had family still in the area. Ellen said she had moved away years ago after Laura disappeared because she could not stand living in a town that had given up on finding her daughter. But when she saw my story online, she came back. She thanked me. She said for 9 years she had lived with not knowing. She said the police had told her Laura had left on her own, that there was nothing to investigate. She said she had tried to push them, tried to hire a private investigator, but no one would help. She said she had started to believe she would never know what happened. Now, she said, at least she had some answers, even if they were not the answers she wanted. I asked if she thought Laura was still alive. Ellen looked at me with the kind of exhaustion that comes from years of hoping and being disappointed. She said she did not know. She said she wanted to believe Laura was out there somewhere, safe, starting over. But deep down, she knew that was not true. She asked me if I thought Evan had killed her. I told her the truth. I said I did not know. But I said I believed Evan knew what happened to Laura, and that eventually he would tell someone, either because he wanted to, or because the pressure would break him. Ellen nodded. She said she would wait. She said she had been waiting for 9 years. She could wait a little longer. She walked away, and I stood there in the rain, watching her go. The investigation continued. Grimmer was placed on administrative leave pending an internal review. The Millridge Police Department released a statement saying they took all complaints seriously and were cooperating fully with the state police. It was the kind of statement that said nothing and meant less. But the pressure did not let up. More women came forward. More stories surfaced. The case grew beyond Laura, beyond Sarah, beyond Millridge. It became a story about how institutions fail victims, about how predators hide in plain sight, about how silence protects the guilty. And in the middle of it all, I kept searching for Laura. I contacted every shelter, every hospital, every morgue within a 5-state radius. I searched through unidentified remains databases. I followed up on every tip that came in, no matter how far-fetched. Most of them led nowhere, but one caught my attention. A woman called me and said she thought she had seen Laura 3 years ago. She said she had been volunteering at a women's shelter in a city 4 hours west of Millridge. A woman had come in late one night, no belongings, no ID, refusing to give her name. The shelter staff had taken her in, given her a bed, tried to help, but the woman had left the next morning before anyone could talk to her. The volunteer said she had thought about that woman many times over the years. She said the woman had looked terrified, like she was running from something. And when the volunteers saw Lara's photo in the news, she was almost certain it was the same person. I asked if the shelter kept records. The volunteer said they did, but the woman had refused to provide any information. There was no file, no intake form, nothing. I asked if there was any security footage. The volunteer said the shelter had cameras at the entrance, but the footage was only kept for 90 days. It was long gone now. It was another dead end. But it was also a glimmer of possibility. If Laura had been alive 3 years ago, if she had been moving, hiding, trying to stay ahead of Evan, then maybe she was still out there. Or maybe she had run out of places to hide. I could not let it go. I kept digging. I kept following leads. I kept pushing. And slowly, piece by piece, the story of what happened to Laura began to take shape. But the final piece, the one that would answer the question everyone was asking, was still missing. And I was running out of places to look. The weeks following Evan Collier's arrest were a blur of interviews, follow-ups, and dead ends. The media attention had sparked a flood of tips, most of them well-intentioned, but ultimately useless. People claimed to have seen Laura at gas stations, shopping malls, airports. Every lead had to be checked, and every lead turned into nothing. But the investigation into Evan himself was yielding results. The forensic team that searched his house had found more than just photographs and notebooks. They had found a small external hard drive hidden inside a hollowed-out book on a shelf in his bedroom. The drive contained thousands of files, images, videos, documents. It was a digital archive of his obsession, spanning over a decade. The files were organized by name. Each woman he had targeted had her own folder. Sarah Linden's folder contained over 200 images, taken over a 6-month period. There were photos of her apartment building, her car, her workplace. There were screenshots of her social media posts. There were notes about her schedule, her habits, her friends. Laura Voss's folder was larger. Over 500 files. The earliest image was dated nearly 10 years ago, a full year before she disappeared. The surveillance had been meticulous. Evan had documented her life in exhaustive detail. Where she shopped, where she walked her dog, what time she left for work, what time she came home. But the most disturbing part of Laura's folder was a subfolder labeled Project. Inside were documents, plans. Evan had written out scenarios, step by step, detailing how he could approach her, how he could isolate her, how he could make her dependent on him. He had researched coercive control tactics, gaslighting techniques, ways to manipulate someone into silence. One document, dated 2 months before Laura disappeared, was titled Final Approach. It outlined a plan to stage a chance encounter, to position himself as someone helpful, someone trustworthy. The plan included contingencies for if she rejected him, if she reported him, if she tried to run. The final line of the document read, "If all else fails, containment is necessary." Containment. The word made my stomach turn. It was clinical, detached, like he was talking about a problem to be solved rather than a human being. The state police brought in a forensic psychologist to review the files. Her assessment was clear. Evan Collier exhibited behaviors consistent with obsessive stalking disorder, narcissistic personality traits, and a complete lack of empathy. She said the level of planning and documentation suggested someone who believed he was entitled to control the women he targeted. She also said that escalation was common in these cases. If his previous methods had failed to achieve the control he wanted, he would have moved to more extreme measures. The psychologist's report concluded with a warning. Based on the content of the files and the pattern of behavior, it was highly likely Evan had moved beyond surveillance and harassment. The probability that he had committed an act of violence was significant. But they still did not have a body. And without a body, without physical evidence of a homicide, the charges against Evan remained limited to stalking and harassment. His lawyer was already preparing a defense, arguing that while his behavior was inappropriate, it was not criminal. The photographs were taken in public spaces. The notes were private documents. The plans were fantasies, never acted upon. It was a weak defense, but it was something. And in the absence of proof that Evan had actually harmed anyone, it might be enough to keep him from spending the rest of his life in prison. I could not let that happen. I went back to the storage unit one more time. I needed to understand why Evan had rented it, why he had kept the evidence there, and why he had stopped paying. There had to be a reason. People like Evan did not leave loose ends unless something forced them to. I stood in Unit 217 and walked through the timeline again. Evan rented the unit under a fake name. He paid cash every month for 11 months. The payment stopped in April, 9 years ago. Laura disappeared in May, 1 month later. Why stop paying in April? Had something happened that made him feel he no longer needed the unit? Or had something happened that made him unable to pay? I pulled Evan's financial records. It took some digging and some help from a contact who owed me a favor, but I finally got access to his bank statements from that period. In April, 9 years ago, Evan had made a large cash withdrawal, $3,000. 2 weeks later, he made another withdrawal, $5,000. That was unusual. Evan's spending patterns were consistent and predictable. Small purchases, regular bills, nothing extravagant. But in the span of 2 weeks, he had pulled $8,000 in cash out of his account. What had he needed that much cash for? I checked his credit card statements. Nothing unusual. No large purchases, no travel expenses, no hotel stays. The cash had been used for something off the books. I thought about the storage unit. The rental was cheap, maybe $60 a month. Even if he had prepaid for a year, that would only be $700. So the cash was not for the storage unit. I thought about containment. If Evan had escalated from surveillance to abduction, he would have needed a place to take Laura. Somewhere isolated. Somewhere he could control. Somewhere no one would look. I started searching for property records. Evan had owned a house in Millridge at the time, but that was too visible, too risky. I looked for rental agreements, lease contracts, anything that might indicate he had access to another location. I found nothing under his name, but then I remembered the storage unit had been rented under an alias, Michael Stern. I searched for that name in property records, rental databases, utility account registrations. I found a hit. Michael Stern had signed a short-term lease for a cabin 9 years ago in a rural area about 40 miles north of Millridge. The lease had been for 3 months, paid in cash. The property was owned by a man named Harold Finch, who rented it out occasionally to hunters and fishermen. I tracked down Harold Finch. He was in his 70s now, living in a nursing home 2 towns over. I visited him and explained that I was investigating a case that might involve one of his former tenants. Harold was sharp, despite his age. He remembered the cabin rental. He said a man had called him out of the blue, asking if the cabin was available. The man said he was a writer and needed a quiet place to work for a few months. Harold said that was fine. The man paid cash up front, 3 months' rent, and said he would not need much in the way of amenities. Harold gave him the keys and did not hear from him again until the lease ended. I asked what the man looked like. Harold described him as average height, clean-cut, polite. He said the man wore glasses and drove a blue sedan. Evan Collier. I asked if Harold had ever visited the cabin while the man was renting it. Harold said no. The cabin was remote, and he was not in good health even back then. He said he trusted his tenants to take care of the place. When the lease ended, the man returned the keys by mail, and that was that. I asked if Harold had noticed anything unusual about the cabin after the man left. Harold thought for a moment, then said the place had been cleaned. Thoroughly cleaned. More so than most tenants bothered with. Harold remembered thinking it was strange, but he appreciated not having to do the work himself. I asked if the cabin was still standing. Harold said yes, as far as he knew. He had not rented it out in years. It was too far out, too run down. He said he had been meaning to sell the property, but had not gotten around to it. I asked for the address. Harold gave it to me. I drove out to the cabin that same afternoon. The road was unpaved, winding through dense forest. The cabin was set back from the road, barely visible through the trees. It was small, one story, wood siding weathered grey. The windows were covered with dust and grime. The door was locked with a rusted padlock. I walked around the perimeter. The ground was overgrown with weeds and brush. There were no signs of recent activity. I tried the windows, all locked. I looked for a way in and found a small basement window on the side of the cabin, half hidden by overgrown shrubs. The glass was cracked. I used a rock to break it the rest of the way and crawled inside. The basement was dark and smelled of mildew. I turned on my flashlight and swept it across the room. Concrete floor, stone walls, a few pieces of old furniture covered with tarps, and in the corner, a metal ring bolted into the floor. I stepped closer. The ring was old, but not original to the cabin. It had been installed deliberately, anchored deep into the concrete. There were scratches around it, like something had been dragged across the floor, and on the wall nearby, faint marks, scratches. The kind of marks fingernails make when someone is trying to claw their way out. I felt my chest tighten. This was it. This was the place Evan had taken Laura. I searched the rest of the basement. There was a small utility sink in one corner, stained and cracked. A wooden chair, overturned. A pile of old blankets, moldy and torn. And in the far corner, barely visible in the beam of my flashlight, a small object half buried in the dirt floor. I crouched down and brushed away the dirt. It was a bracelet, silver, with a small charm in the shape of a dog. I picked it up carefully and turned it over. On the back of the charm, engraved in tiny letters, was a name, Boone. Laura's dog. I sat back on my heels, holding the bracelet in my hand. This was evidence, real, physical evidence that Laura had been here. I pulled out my phone and took photographs of everything. The metal ring, the scratches on the wall, the bracelet. Then I called the state police. They arrived 2 hours later with a forensic team. They secured the scene and began processing it. They found blood traces on the concrete floor, too degraded to yield DNA, but enough to confirm that someone had been injured here. They found hair fibers caught in the metal ring. They found more scratches on the walls, some of them forming words. Help. Please. The forensic team worked through the night. I stood outside in the dark, listening to the rain start up again, watching the lights from their equipment glow through the cabin windows. By morning, they had enough. The evidence was conclusive. Laura Voss had been held in that cabin. She had been restrained. She had been hurt. And based on the amount of blood and the condition of the scene, it was unlikely she had survived. The state police arrested Evan Collier again, this time on charges of kidnapping and murder. His lawyer tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that there was no body, that the cabin could have been used by anyone, but the forensic evidence tied Evan to the scene. The lease had been signed by Michael Stern, the same alias used for the storage unit. The timeline matched. The bracelet matched. Evan was held without bail. I attended every hearing. I watched as the case built against him, piece by piece. The prosecution brought in Sarah Linden to testify about the pattern of stalking. They brought in other women who had been targeted. They brought in the forensic psychologist who explained how Evan's behavior had escalated from surveillance to control to violence. And through it all, Evan said nothing. He sat in the courtroom, expressionless, staring straight ahead. He did not testify. He did not react. He gave nothing away. But the evidence spoke for him. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. They found him guilty on all counts: kidnapping, murder, stalking, harassment. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ellen Voss was in the courtroom when the verdict was read. She sat in the front row, her hands clasped in her lap, tears streaming down her face. When the judge announced the sentence, she closed her eyes and nodded once, like she had been holding her breath for 9 years and could finally exhale. After the sentencing, I met with Ellen outside the courthouse. She thanked me again. She said it was not the ending she had hoped for, but it was an ending. She said she could finally stop wondering. She could finally grieve. I asked if she had any plans to hold a memorial for Laura. Ellen said she would. She said she wanted to do it at the place where Laura used to walk Boone, a trail on the edge of town that overlooked the river. She said Laura had loved that trail. She said it felt right to remember her there. I attended the memorial 2 weeks later. It was a small gathering. Ellen, a few of Laura's old co-workers, Jennifer Marsh, Diane Rucker, a handful of people who had known Laura and had never forgotten her. Ellen spoke about her daughter. She said Laura had been kind, thoughtful, and stronger than anyone gave her credit for. She said Laura had deserved a life full of joy and peace, and that it had been stolen from her by someone who believed he had the right to take it. Ellen placed flowers by a tree at the edge of the trail. Others did the same. We stood in silence for a while, listening to the sound of the river below. Before I left, Ellen pulled me aside. She said there was one more thing she wanted me to know. She said that after the trial, the police had continued searching the area around the cabin. They had brought in cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar. And 3 days ago, they had found remains. The remains were buried in a shallow grave about 100 yards from the cabin, hidden under a pile of rocks and brush. The forensic team had confirmed that the remains were female and that they had been there for approximately 9 years. DNA testing was still ongoing, but Ellen said the police had told her it was almost certainly Laura. Ellen said she was grateful they had found her. She said Laura could finally come home. I did not know what to say. I just nodded. Ellen hugged me, then walked back to join the others. I stood by the trail for a long time, watching the river move below, thinking about Laura, thinking about how many years she had been missing, thinking about how many people had failed her before someone finally listened. I thought about Sarah Linden, who had been terrorized and dismissed. I thought about the other women who had come forward, who had lived with fear and silence because no one believed them. I thought about Detective Grimmer, who had buried cases and protected predators because it was easier than doing his job. Grimmer had been forced to resign. The internal investigation had found multiple instances of misconduct, and he was facing criminal charges for obstruction of justice. His career was over. His reputation was destroyed. But it felt like too little, too late. The damage had already been done. I walked back to my car and sat behind the wheel, staring at the rain-streaked windshield. I thought about the storage unit, the cardboard box, the photographs that had started it all. I thought about how close this case had come to staying buried forever. If Dennis Howell had not called me, if Angela had not reached out, if Sarah had not been brave enough to talk, if I had not kept pushing, how many other cases were still buried? How many other victims were still waiting for someone to care enough to dig? I did not have an answer, but I knew I could not stop looking. I started the car and pulled out onto the road. The rain was steady now, drumming on the roof. I turned on the wipers and drove back toward Millridge, back toward the next case, the next question, the next person who needed someone to listen. Because that is what this work is. Listening, digging, refusing to let the silence win. And sometimes, if you are lucky, finding the truth before it is too late. But not always. Not for Laura, the months following Evan Collier's conviction were quieter, but the case was not over. The DNA results came back, confirming what Ellen had already known in her heart. The remains found near the cabin were Laura's. The medical examiner's report indicated she had died from blunt force trauma to the head, likely within days of her abduction. She had been buried quickly, carelessly, in a grave that was never meant to be found. Ellen arranged a proper funeral. It was held on a grey afternoon at a small church on the edge of Millridge. The turnout was larger than I expected. People who had known Laura, people who had followed the case, people who simply wanted to pay their respects to a woman who had been failed by so many. I sat in the back and watched as Ellen stood at the front, reading a letter she had written to her daughter. She talked about the little girl who used to collect rocks by the river, the teenager who volunteered at the animal shelter, the young woman who had just started to figure out who she wanted to be when her life was taken. Ellen's voice broke several times, but she kept reading. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and placed it on the casket. Then she sat down, and the room was silent except for the sound of rain against the windows. After the service, I stood outside under an overhang, watching people file out. A few of them nodded at me as they passed. Some shook my hand. One woman, elderly, with a cane, stopped and said she was glad someone had finally told Laura's story. She said too many stories in Millridge had gone untold for too long. I asked what she meant. She said Millridge was a small town, and small towns had a way of protecting their own. She said people knew things, but they did not talk about them. Not to outsiders, not to the police, not even to each other, sometimes. She said she hoped things would change now, but she did not sound convinced. I thought about that conversation for days afterward. The woman was right. Millridge had protected Evan Collier, not because people liked him, but because silence was easier than confrontation, because questioning authority was uncomfortable, because no one wanted to believe that someone they knew, someone who seemed normal, could be capable of something so monstrous. But silence had cost Laura her life, and it had nearly let Evan get away with it. I decided to write a longer piece about the case, not just the facts, but the larger story, the systemic failures, the pattern of ignored complaints, the way institutions prioritize their own reputations over the safety of the people they are supposed to protect. I reached out to other journalists, other investigators, people who had covered similar cases. I wanted to understand how common this was, how many other women had been dismissed, disbelieved, or turned away when they tried to report stalking or harassment. The answer was staggering. Hundreds, thousands, women who had filed restraining orders that were never enforced, women who had called the police and been told there was nothing that could be done until an actual crime was committed, women who had been stalked for months or years before their cases were taken seriously, if they were taken seriously at all. And in too many cases, by the time law enforcement acted, it was too late. I interviewed a former prosecutor who specialized in domestic violence and stalking cases. She told me that the legal system was not designed to handle these crimes effectively. Stalking laws varied wildly by state, and even in places where the laws were strong, enforcement was inconsistent. She said officers were often undertrained, and judges were often skeptical of victims who could not provide concrete evidence of imminent harm. She said the burden of proof was always on the victim. The victim had to document every instance of contact, every threatening message, every unwanted encounter. The victim had to prove they were afraid, that their fear was reasonable, that the perpetrator's behavior met the legal definition of stalking. And even then, the consequences were often minimal. A warning, a restraining order, a misdemeanor charge. It was not until someone was physically harmed or killed that the system treated the case as serious. By then, of course, it was too late. I asked the prosecutor what could be done to change that. She said the system needed to shift from reactive to proactive. Law enforcement needed better training to recognize the warning signs of escalating violence. Courts needed to take restraining orders seriously and enforce them rigorously. And society as a whole needed to stop dismissing victims as paranoid or overreacting. She said the signs were always there, the patterns were always the same, but people had to be willing to see them and to act on them before someone got hurt. I published the piece 3 months after Laura's funeral. It ran in a national magazine and was picked up by several major outlets. The response was overwhelming. Victims reached out to share their own stories. Advocacy groups contacted me to discuss policy reforms. Law enforcement agencies invited me to speak at trainings. But the most meaningful response came from Ellen. She called me a few days after the piece was published and said she had read it. She said it was hard to read, but it was important. She said Laura's story mattered, and she was grateful that it was being told in a way that might help others. She said she had started volunteering with a victims advocacy organization. She said she wanted to help other families navigate the legal system to make sure they did not feel as alone and helpless as she had felt. She said it was the only way she could make sense of what had happened to Laura, by trying to prevent it from happening to someone else. I told her I thought Laura would be proud of her. Ellen said she hoped so. We talked for a while longer. Ellen told me she had finally been able to go back to the trail where Lara used to walk Boone. She said it had taken her months to work up the courage, but she had done it. She said it had been painful, but also healing. She said she felt close to Laura there, in a way she had not felt anywhere else. Before we hung up, Ellen said one more thing. She said she had forgiven me for not finding Lara in time to save her. I had not realized I needed forgiveness, but hearing her say it broke something open inside me. I said I was sorry I had not been able to do more. Ellen said I had done everything I could. She said sometimes, no matter how hard you fight, you cannot change the past, but you can change the future, and that was enough. After the call ended, I sat in silence for a long time. I thought about all the cases I had worked over the years, the ones that had been solved, the ones that had not, the ones where I had found answers, and the ones where I had only found more questions. I thought about the weight of carrying other people's grief, other people's anger, other people's need for justice. I thought about how exhausting it was, and how necessary. And I thought about Laura, about the life she should have had, the years she should have lived, the person she should have been allowed to become. I could not bring her back. No one could. But I could make sure her story was told. I could make sure her death meant something. I could make sure that the system that had failed her would be held accountable. That was the only kind of justice left. Around that same time, I started receiving messages from people in Millridge. Some were supportive, others were not. A few accused me of exploiting Laura's death for attention. One anonymous message said I should leave Millridge alone, that I had caused enough trouble. I ignored most of them, but one message stood out. It was from a woman who said she had information about another case, one that had been buried years ago. She said it involved someone powerful, someone who had connections throughout the county. She said if I was interested, she would meet with me, but only in person and only on her terms. I agreed. We met at a rest stop halfway between Millridge and the city where I lived. It was late afternoon, overcast, the kind of day where the light never quite breaks through the clouds. The woman was in her early 50s, dressed in a business suit, her expression guarded. She introduced herself as Monica Gerard. Monica said she had been an assistant district attorney in the county prosecutor's office 15 years ago. She said she had handled a case involving a teenage girl who had been sexually assaulted by a man in his 30s. The girl had reported it to the police, and the case had been referred to the prosecutor's office. Monica said the evidence was strong. The girl's testimony was consistent and detailed. There were text messages. There was physical evidence. It should have been an easy conviction. But the case had been killed before it ever went to trial. Monica said the man accused of the assault was the son of a county commissioner. The commissioner had called the prosecutor directly and asked him to reconsider pressing charges. He said his son had made a mistake, that he was willing to get counseling, that dragging the case through the courts would ruin his life. The prosecutor had agreed. The charges were dropped. The girl was told it was in her best interest to move on. Monica said she had objected, argued, even threatened to resign. But the decision had been made above her head. There was nothing she could do. Monica said she quit the prosecutor's office 6 months later. She said she could not work in a system that protected the powerful and abandoned the vulnerable. She said she had thought about that case every day since. She said when she saw what I had uncovered in Laura's case, she realized she could not stay silent anymore. I asked if the girl would be willing to talk. Monica shook her head. She said the girl, now a woman, had moved out of state and wanted nothing to do with Millridge or the case. She said the experience had destroyed her trust in the legal system, and she had spent years in therapy trying to recover. I asked if Monica had any documentation. She said she had kept copies of the case file against protocol because she knew it might be the only proof that the case had ever existed. She said she would give me the file, but I had to promise to protect the victim's identity. I promised. Monica handed me a folder. Inside were police reports, medical records, text message transcripts, and notes from witness interviews. Everything needed to prosecute a case. Everything that had been ignored because the perpetrator had the right connections. I asked Monica what she wanted me to do with it. She said she wanted me to expose it. She said the man who had assaulted that girl was still living in the area, still respected, still untouchable. She said he had a family now, a career, a reputation, and no one knew what he had done. She said it was time people knew. I spent the next several weeks verifying the information in Monica's file. I contacted witnesses, cross-referenced records, and confirmed the timeline. Everything checked out. The case had been real. The evidence had been solid, and the decision to drop the charges had been a deliberate act of corruption. I also confirmed the identity of the perpetrator. His name was Brandon Kettering. He was now a real estate developer, well known in the county, active in local politics. He had never been charged with a crime. His record was clean. But the truth was not. I wrote the story carefully. I focused on the facts, on the pattern of institutional failure, on the way power had been used to silence a victim. I did not sensationalize. I did not editorialize. I let the evidence speak for itself. When the story was published, the reaction was immediate. Brandon Kettering denied the allegations, called them fabricated, threatened to sue. But the documentation was undeniable. The prosecutor who had killed the case was no longer in office, but the county opened an investigation. The victim, despite her initial reluctance, agreed to provide a statement. The case was reopened. Charges were filed. Brandon Kettering was arrested. And once again, I found myself sitting in a courtroom, watching as the system tried to correct a failure that was 15 years old. The trial was long. The defense argued that the case was too old, that memories were unreliable, that the evidence was circumstantial. But the victim testified. She was calm, composed, and devastating. She described what had happened to her in detail. She described how she had been told her case did not matter, She described how she had spent 15 years believing that no one cared. The jury believed her. Brandon Kettering was convicted and sentenced to 12 years in prison. After the verdict, I spoke briefly with Monica Gerard outside the courthouse. She said she felt like a weight had been lifted. She said she had carried the guilt of that case for so long. And now, finally, there was some measure of justice. I asked if she thought it was enough. Monica paused. Then she said justice was never enough to undo the harm, but it was better than silence. It was better than letting the guilty walk free. She was right. As I drove home that night, I thought about all the cases I had worked, all the stories I had uncovered. Laura, Sarah, the victim in Brandon Kettering's case, and the countless others whose names I would never know. I thought about the system that was supposed to protect them and how often it failed. I thought about the people who had the power to help and chose not to. I thought about the victims who had been brave enough to come forward and had been met with indifference or hostility. And I thought about the ones who had never come forward at all, the ones who were still living in fear, still carrying their trauma in silence, still waiting for someone to believe them. Those were the cases that haunted me the most, the ones I would never hear about, the ones that would remain buried forever. But I also thought about the cases that had been solved, the predators who had been stopped, the families who had finally gotten answers, the victims who had finally been heard. That was why I kept doing this, not because I believed the system would change overnight, not because I thought I could save everyone, but because every case mattered, every victim mattered. And sometimes, if you kept digging, if you refused to let the silence win, you could make a difference. Not always, but sometimes, and sometimes was enough to keep going. 6 months after Brandon Kettering's conviction, I received a letter in the mail. It was postmarked from a town I had never heard of, 3 states away. The handwriting on the envelope was shaky, uncertain. Inside was a single piece of notebook paper, folded twice. The letter was from a woman who identified herself only as M. She said she had been following my work. She said she had read about Laura Voss, about Sarah Linden, about the other cases I had covered. She said she had something to tell me, but she was afraid. She said she had tried to report what happened to her years ago, but no one had believed her. She said she had given up on ever seeing justice. But she said if I was willing to listen, she would talk. She included a phone number at the bottom of the letter. No email, no address, just a number and a request that I call on a Tuesday evening after 7. I called the following Tuesday. The phone rang 4 times before someone picked up. A woman's voice, quiet and careful, said hello. I identified myself. There was a long pause. Then the woman said her name was Mallory Keane. She said she had lived in Millridge 12 years ago. She said something had happened to her there, something she had never fully told anyone. I asked if she was comfortable talking about it now. Mallory said she did not know, but she wanted to try. She said she had kept it inside for so long that it felt like it was eating her alive. I told her to take her time. I said I would listen to whatever she was ready to share. Mallory took a breath. Then she started talking. She said she had moved to Millridge 12 years ago, for a job at a manufacturing plant on the outskirts of town. She was 23, fresh out of college, trying to start her life. She rented a small apartment downtown. She kept to herself. She worked long hours and spent her weekends reading or hiking. A few months after she arrived, she started noticing a man. He was always around, at the grocery store, at the coffee shop she visited on Sunday mornings, in the parking lot of her apartment building. At first, she thought it was coincidence. Millridge was a small town. You saw the same people over and over. But then she started noticing patterns. The man would show up wherever she was, no matter the time of day. He never approached her. He never spoke to her. He just watched. Mallory said she started changing her routine. She shopped at different stores. She took different routes to work. She stopped going to the coffee shop, but the man always found her. One night, she came home from work and found her apartment door unlocked. She was certain she had locked it that morning. She went inside carefully, looking for signs of a break-in. Nothing was missing. Nothing was out of place. But her bedroom felt wrong. The closet door was open. The blankets on her bed were slightly rumpled, like someone had been sitting there. She called the police. An officer came and looked around. He said there was no sign of forced entry. He said she probably just forgot to lock the door. He told her to be more careful. Mallory said she started having panic attacks. She could not sleep. She felt like someone was watching her all the time. She installed a chain lock on her door. She kept a knife on her nightstand, but it did not help. 2 weeks later, she found a photograph slipped under her door. It was a picture of her, taken through her bedroom window. She was asleep. She was asleep in her bed. The angle was from outside, looking in. She called the police again. This time, a different officer responded. He took the photograph and said he would file a report. He asked if she had any idea who might be doing this. Mallory described the man she had been seeing everywhere. The officer wrote it down. He said he would look into it. But nothing happened. No follow-up, no investigation. Mallory called the station twice, asking for updates. Both times, she was told the case was still under review. A month later, Mallory came home and found another photograph. This one showed her sitting in her car, taken from the back seat. She had not noticed anyone in her car. She had not heard anyone get in or out. But someone had been there, close enough to touch her, and she had not known. That was when Mallory decided to leave. She quit her job, broke her lease, and moved back in with her parents. She did not tell anyone why. She said she could not explain it without sounding paranoid or crazy. She said she just wanted to disappear, to go somewhere the man could not find her. For years, she tried to move on. She went to therapy. She changed her name. She moved several more times, always to places where no one knew her. She said she never felt safe, even when she knew logically that she was far away and that the man had no way of finding her. And then she saw my article about Laura Voss. She saw the photographs. She saw the pattern of surveillance. She saw the description of Evan Collier. And she realized the man who had stalked her looked exactly like him. I asked Mallory if she was certain. She said she was. She said she had thought about that man's face every day for 12 years. She said she would recognize him anywhere. I asked if she had any evidence from that time. Mallory said she had kept the photographs. She said she had held on to them because they were the only proof she had that it had really happened, that she was not imagining it. She said she would send them to me if I wanted. I said yes. I gave her my address and told her to send them however she felt most comfortable. The photographs arrived a week later in a padded envelope with no return address. There were 3 of them. The first showed Mallory asleep in her bed, taken from outside her window. The second showed her in her car. The third showed her walking into her apartment building, taken from across the street. The style was identical to the photographs found in the storage unit. The angles, the framing, the cold, clinical quality. And in the third photograph, barely visible in the background, was a dark blue sedan parked at the curb. I had the photographs analyzed by a forensic imaging specialist. She confirmed that they were at least 12 years old, based on the print quality and the type of photo paper used. She also noted that the metadata embedded in the images, though limited, suggested they had been taken with the same type of camera used in the photographs of Laura Voss. It was not definitive proof, but it was enough. I contacted the state police and provided them with Mallory's statement and the photographs. They reopened their investigation into Evan Collier, looking for evidence that his crimes extended further back than they had originally believed. The investigation revealed more. Detectives interviewed former residents of Millridge, former employees of businesses where Evan had worked, former neighbors. Slowly, more stories emerged. A woman who had worked at a bank where Evan serviced the computers said she had felt uncomfortable around him. She said he had asked her personal questions about where she lived, whether she lived alone, what time she got off work. She said he had lingered in the building longer than necessary, walking past her desk multiple times. Another woman said Evan had done IT work for the dental office where she worked as a hygienist. She said he had installed software on her computer, and then, weeks later, she discovered spyware that was logging her keystrokes and tracking her internet activity. She had assumed it was a virus, but now she wondered if Evan had installed it deliberately. A third woman said Evan had rented the apartment next to hers for 2 months, years ago. She said she had never seen him during the day, only late at night. She said she heard him moving around at odd hours, and once she heard him speaking on the phone, describing someone in detail. A woman, her height, her hair color, her routine. The woman said it had made her uncomfortable, but she had not known what to do about it. When Evan's lease ended, he disappeared, and she never saw him again. Each story added another layer. Each story revealed another victim. The pattern was undeniable. Evan Collier had been hunting women for over a decade. Laura had not been his first victim. She had not even been his 10th. She was simply the one who had not escaped. The state police compiled all the evidence and presented it to the prosecutor. Additional charges were filed against Evan: stalking, harassment, unlawful surveillance, computer crimes. Each charge represented another woman, another life disrupted, another case that had been ignored or dismissed. Evan remained in prison. His sentence was already life without parole. The new charges would not change that. But they mattered. They mattered to the women who had been afraid to come forward. They mattered to the women who had come forward and been turned away. They mattered because it meant the system was finally acknowledging what had been done to them. Mallory Keane agreed to testify at a hearing for the additional charges. I attended, sitting in the gallery, watching as she took the stand. She was nervous, but she was steady. She described what had happened to her 12 years ago. She described the fear, the helplessness, the feeling of being watched. She described how the police had dismissed her, how she had been made to feel like she was overreacting. And then she looked directly at Evan, sitting at the defense table, and she said she was not afraid of him anymore. She said he had taken years of her life, years where she had been too scared to live fully. But she was done letting him have that power. Evan stared back at her, expressionless. He did not react. He did not speak. The judge found him guilty on all additional counts. The sentences would run concurrent with his existing life sentence. It was, in practical terms, meaningless. But symbolically, it was everything. After the hearing, I spoke with Mallory outside the courthouse. She said she felt lighter, like she had finally set down a weight she had been carrying for too long. She said she was proud of herself for testifying, even though it had been one of the hardest things she had ever done. I asked what she was going to do next. She said she was going back to her life. She said she had a job she liked, friends she trusted, a small apartment that felt safe. She said she was going to keep living, because that was the best way to prove that Evan had not won. I told her I admired her courage. She smiled, a small, tired smile, and said courage was just fear that had decided to keep moving forward. I thought about that a lot in the weeks that followed. Courage as fear in motion. That was what all of these women had shown. Sarah, who had agreed to talk even though it brought back her trauma. Mallory, who had testified even though it terrified her. Ellen, who had kept pushing for answers even when the system told her to give up. And Laura, who had fought for her life even when she must have known she was not going to survive. I returned to Millridge one last time, a year after Laura's funeral. I wanted to see the town again, to walk the streets where this had all begun, to understand how a place could hold so much silence and so much pain. The town looked the same shuttered storefronts, the same empty parking lots, the same grey sky, threatening rain. But something felt different. There were new signs in some of the windows. A community centre offering support services for victims of domestic violence. A poster for a town hall meeting on public safety. Small changes, but changes nonetheless. I drove out to the trail where Ellen had held Laura's memorial. The flowers were long gone, but someone had placed a small stone marker at the base of the tree. It was simple, unpolished, with Laura's name carved into it, and a single word beneath, remembered. I stood there for a long time, listening to the river below, watching the light filter through the trees. I thought about how many people had failed Laura, the police who had not investigated, the system that had not protected her, the town that had stayed silent. But I also thought about the people who had fought for her. Ellen, Dennis, Angela, Sarah, Mallory, all the people who had refused to let her story be buried. That was the difference between a case that disappeared and a case that was solved. Not evidence, not luck, but people who cared enough to keep digging, to keep asking questions, to keep demanding answers. I left the trail and drove back to the main road. As I passed the police station, I saw a new sign by the entrance, Millridge Police Department, serving with integrity and accountability. I did not know if that was true. I did not know if the culture had really changed, or if it was just words on a sign. But I hoped it was true. I hoped the next person who walked through those doors, asking for help, would be heard. I hoped the next case would not be buried. Because that was all any of us could do. Keep hoping, keep fighting, keep shining light into the dark corners where predators hide and systems fail. I drove out of Millridge as the rain started again, steady and cold. I turned on the wipers and kept driving, back toward the city, back toward the next case, the next story, the next question that needed answering. Because the work was never finished. There would always be another storage unit, another buried case, another victim waiting for someone to care. And I would keep looking, keep listening, keep refusing to let the silence win. That was the promise I made to Laura, to Sarah, to Mallory, to every victim whose name I would never know. I would not stop. Not ever.